Excellent. Thank you, Bethany. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us today on a cold, snowy day here in Minnesota. But again, really appreciate your time. Today's topic is how to combat fraud in your organization. We'd like to talk a little bit about the fraud environment, some tools you can implement, and a cost-effective way to help your organization, and just have a nice discussion around that, and a little bit on the new 2022 ACFE report to the nations that was released recently, a little bit of some statistics and things on that nature. So we'll kick it off with introductions. I will start. Like I said, good afternoon. I'm Steve Wishman. I am a partner and lead our forensic practice here with Bergen KDV. And I've been with the firm since 1987, pushing 35 years. Came up through the audit ranks and spent about the first 20 to 25 years doing specifically audits of local governments and nonprofits. For about the last 10 years or so, I've been working in the fraud and forensic field. I'm a certified fraud examiner and certified financial forensics through the AICPA and one other organization. But again, a lot of audit background, but exclusively working in the fraud and forensic field now. And what that is proactive fraud risk assessment, risk tools, reactive fraud investigations, and just consulting relating to that. So happy to be here today to share my journey and my experience, and hopefully you can take a few tidbits away before the end of the session, and about some practical implementation things that you can do in your organization to help minimize your fraud risks overall. With me today is Michael Basil. Michael, go ahead and introduce yourself, and we'll kick it off.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Hi, as Steve said, my name is Michael Basil, and I am a manager in Bergen KDV's Forensic and Data Services Group. I work out of our Bloomington, Minnesota office, and I am in my 19th year with the firm. I started out my career in the governmental audit groups. I've been mostly doing governmental audits along with some nonprofit and corporate audits mixed in there as well. I've been interested in forensic accounting and data analytics since early on in my career, and my passion for helping organizations by digging into fraud cases to try to figure out who did what, how they did it, how much they got away with, and what they did with the money has grown over the years. And so about 8 years ago, I moved closer to working more towards my passion is by becoming certified as a fraud examiner. And so today I'm able to spend most of my time completing data monitoring and fraud examinations for all different kinds of organizations. And I really think it's important that every organization understand what your fraud risks are, and keep in mind that fraud does happen more often than you think. And so you always want to make sure that you understand your organization's fraud risks, that you continually monitor those risks, and then mitigate the risks when you can. So I'm happy that you're here today to learn how you can combat fraud in your organization. So I'll start out with just a little definition of fraud. Most of you, when you see fraud, you're probably going to know what it is. You're going to recognize that it's fraud, but the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, or the ACFE, defines occupational fraud as the use of one's occupation for personal enrichment through the deliberate misuse or misapplication of the employing organization's resources or assets. And so they also lay out 5 elements that are necessary for fraud to be present as well. And that includes a false representation of a material fact. That false representation was made intentionally, knowingly, or recklessly. That false representation is believed and relied upon and then acted upon by the victim. And then finally, that victim suffers a financial damage as a result. So Steve mentioned the 2022 report to the nations a little bit earlier. So every 2 years, the ACFE gathers information from certified fraud examiners like us from around the world that provides information to the ACFE about fraud cases that they've investigated. And so the ACFE then takes that information and summarizes it into this report to the nations and provides a bunch of statistics and facts surrounding the costs of fraud, the effects of fraud, and it really is meant to help us better prevent, detect, and respond to fraud. And so this latest version of the report was just issued about 2 weeks ago, so it is fresh off the press. And this particular study examined about 2,100 cases from certified fraud examiners from 133 different countries. And these cases, these 21 cases alone, resulted in fraud losses of $3.6 billion. So overall, every year they always talk about, or every study they ask kind of how many or how much an organization typically loses from fraud, and that number again is at 5%. So it's estimated that the typical organization loses 5% of its revenue from fraud every year. So if we take the estimated gross world product for 2021, that's more than $4.7 trillion lost to fraud every year around the world. And so if you think about 5% of your revenues, my assumption is that would likely impact your decisions on how you run your business if you lost 5%. It would likely have an impact on how much you can have available for research and development. It'll probably affect your ability to be able to provide the goods and services that your organization offers. And it might even prevent you from being able to pay your employees' salaries and benefits on a timely basis. And so fraud can have a huge impact on an organization, whether that's 1% of your revenue, 5% of your revenue, or more. And so you really want to make sure that you mitigate your risks when you can to find fraud faster, and then limit your losses when it does occur. And so we'll talk about ways to do that in a few minutes. But first, I just have a few more statistics from the report. The median loss caused by the cases in the study was $117,000. However, there was 21%, in 21% of the cases, there was losses of over $1 million. So pretty significant losses in a fifth of the cases that were part of the study. Asset misappropriation schemes continue to be the most common. They occurred in 86% of the cases and were also the least costly, with a median loss of about $100,000. So when you think of asset misappropriation, this is kind of like theft of cash, theft of inventory, supplies, or equipment. And then on financial statement fraud, these were the least common. So think about Enron and WorldCom. So these schemes were the least common. They occurred in 9% of the cases, but they did result in the highest losses, with a median loss of $593,000. One thing that's new in this report this year is cryptocurrency. So cryptocurrency is getting more popular with fraud schemes, showing up in 8% of all of the cases in this study. And really, cryptocurrency was used for the most part for making bribes, for kickback payments, and then also converting misappropriated assets into cryptocurrency as a way to try to hide assets. So these are just a few of high-level summary and statistics from the report. The entire report is available on the ACFE's website, and there's just a lot of really good information, a lot of charts and graphs and things like that I find really interesting. So I highly recommend you go check it out just to see the type of information that is available.
Absolutely agree. About 96 pages long, I think, and it's maybe even a little shorter than that because I think there's a table of contents in the back, but lots of charts and graphs, easy to read, easy to pick up and understand. Download it for free. Highly recommend you go out and grab that and take a look at it.
Yep. And so now we're going to take a quick look at the fraud triangle. So according to the ACFE and data that is provided by certified fraud examiners, most people who commit fraud are not career criminals. The vast majority of them are employees that are trusted. They have no criminal history, and they don't consider themselves to be lawbreakers. And so the best and kind of the most widely available and accepted method for explaining, why these good people commit fraud is the fraud triangle. This was developed by Dr. Donald Cressy, And he says that these three factors in the fraud triangle must be present in order for an ordinary person to commit fraud. And they all must be present at the same time for fraud to occur, or for it to be able to occur. So understanding these different factors of the fraud triangle can really be helpful in recognizing red flags. So the first leg of the fraud triangle is a pressure, and is what motivates the crime in the first place. So with pressure, the individual has some kind of financial problem that they're not able to solve through legitimate means. So then as a result, they start to consider committing an illegal act such as stealing cash or falsifying financial statements to be able to deal with that problem. And so we'll look at some red flags in a little bit, but the financial problem that the individual might be dealing with might be that they're too deep in personal debt. Their business or their job might be in jeopardy. And so some other examples of that pressure, or of having some pressure, might be a gambling addiction, drug or alcohol addictions. There might be a need to meet productivity targets or budget targets within their organization, or they might just have a desire to have a different social status. And in order to do that, they need to commit fraud and get more money to be able to do that. So that's the pressure side of the fraud triangle. The second leg is opportunity, and this really provides that, the way for an individual to commit fraud. And so the individual must see some way that they can use their position of trust to solve their problem with a low level of perceived risk. So they want to be able to do it where they can hide it, where they're not going to get caught, and where they can do it in secret. And so there's that opportunity there for them to be able to do it and not get caught. And then the third leg of the fraud triangle is rationalization. And as I mentioned earlier, the vast majority of fraudsters don't see themselves as criminals. They just think they're ordinary, regular people, and they're honest people that were caught in a bad set of circumstances. And so because they don't see themselves as criminals, they need to try to rationalize to themselves that it's okay to do what they're going to do, or it's okay to commit fraud. And so some of these rationalizations might be, I was just borrowing the money. I meant to pay it back. I was going to pay it back. That was my plan. Or, I was underpaid. I deserve to be paid. I deserve to be paid more. So the company is not giving it to me, so I'm just going to take it because I do deserve it. And so there's always some way that the individual needs to rationalize to themselves that it's okay to do it, that it makes sense to do it. And so once they do that, once they're able to essentially convince themselves that it's okay for them to do, they'll commit fraud the first time, but then after that, that rationalization just kind of is abandoned after that initial act has taken place, because what happens is they get past that first initial act, they get away with it, and then after they don't get caught, they tend to get greedy, and then they start stealing more often and in larger amounts. So that's really the three different parts of the fraud triangle. And so when you're looking at your organization's fraud risks, really think about the first two legs of the fraud triangle, especially. And so are there any pressures in your organization or with any employee's life that you are aware of that may motivate somebody to commit fraud? And then secondly, are there any opportunities for employees to commit fraud based on your internal control structure or your lack of anti-fraud controls within your organization? So this leads us to our next discussion on internal control issues, and specifically on internal control issues in the cases that were part of the ACFE study. And Steve will lead that discussion.
Yeah, thanks. So again, that whole opportunity is something that you can control. Just a couple comments too about the perpetrator in general. They do start out small. They don't usually start out right away in your organization of defrauding. They're usually there a year or two or three or 5, and the ACFE report to the nations does have a lot of statistics on the actual perpetrator itself as of their tenure and their position within the firm. So they try it one time, yeah, I get away with it, so now I can do it more and more and more. And again, that just kind of snowballs until they're past the point of no return, if you want to say. But from the fraud triangle and the opportunity, one thing as a business owner or significant management in your organization is to look at the internal controls and the studies. Then what the ACFE looks at, why does it happen from an opportunity perspective. Number one is a lack of internal controls. That's the highest, at 29% of the cases said that there was a lack of internal controls. So we all know some organizations are very large. When you look at General Electric or Amazon or Microsoft, those types of things, and some of them are smaller, which is probably most of you that are attending today. So the fact that there is a lack of internal controls doesn't mean you have to go and implement a whole bunch of things, rather than look at what those risks are and implement cost-effective controls to kind of mitigate those risks. So adding on a management review, adding on another set of eyes, if you want to say, looking at things to kind of beef up those internal controls. Second reported 20% was an override of the existing controls. So you do have controls in place, but it's overridden. Maybe you need a second signature and that's not happening. Maybe there's a vendor that needs to be set up, and generally there's a second person that needs to approve that, and that's not happening. So as a result, or new employee, so as a result, those existing controls are overridden, and that opportunity is there to be able to create a fraud risk and a fraudulent transaction. So as far as the override perspective, there again, just basic solutions to develop some spot checks, if you want to say, to make sure your existing controls are working. Kind of those surprise audits, if you want to say, from an internal perspective. If you have the resources and are big enough, internal audit would be part of that as well. But even if you're very small, to say, you know what, once in a while I'm going to look at the payroll register, I'm going to look at the disbursements register, and I'm going to say, show me this invoice, show me this new vendor that we set up and why we're dealing with them, those types of things. So again, just those cost-effective things that you can do. And again, that leads to the third thing at 16%, which is the lack of management review. Very highly correlated with the second one of the override of existing internal controls. But management, trust but verify is kind of what we say. You obviously have to trust your key employees, but you also need to verify that what they're saying, what they're doing is what you're expecting of them. So implement those management controls, that management review. It doesn't have to be every time, but just do some random spot checks. If you have the time and ability to do that, absolutely do that as well. The other control weaknesses is just a tone at the top. The tone at the top is such that you're not providing that ethical culture, if you want to say, within your organization. And the tone at the top, meaning that the owners might be willing to accept some of those risks, which would be negative to the perpetrator, the fraudster, if you want to say, that they're able to then say, well, if management doesn't have that tone at the top to say we have to do everything ethically and by the book, and we have to have internal controls and things on that nature, that again is one of those areas of internal control weaknesses. One of the benefits of the best way to get fraud tips is through the hotline, would also beef up that tone at the top. So management and the ownership is saying, we care about our organization. We'd like you as an owner or as an employee to be able to report anything that you feel is suspicious, and we'll act upon it. We'll research it, and we'll investigate it and make sure that our organization is the best it can be. People like working for organizations that have that level of reporting. And then the last one that's reported is just a lack of competent personnel and oversight roles. It's always great to have an oversight and a second check, if you want to say, on things. But if the people doing the checks aren't competent to know if it's right or wrong, it's really not beneficial to be doing that. So make sure you have the right people looking at the right things, and that the personnel in those oversight roles know when something's right and know when something is wrong, and be able to identify that and be able to report that in a timely manner. Moving on, we'll look at a few of the behavioral red flags that, again, are very consistent within the report to the nations. And as Michael mentioned, every 2 years, the report to the nations comes out. This is the 12th version. So we've obviously got 24 years of data, and these behavioral red flags have been relatively consistent over the last 3 or 4 cycles, if you want to say. Broken out into 2 categories, work-life balance and then personal life balance. So again, these key things to look at, both from a work perspective and a personal perspective. Again, from a work perspective, making sure that there's no unusually close associations with vendors or customers. Again, that can lead to kickbacks and things in that nature, and contracts that are entered into that are not to the advantage, to the best for the organization. Maybe you're paying a higher price for a vendor or a customer just because there's a close relationship. And just those overall control issues and unwillingness to share their duties or separate those duties, or refusal to take vacations towards the bottom there, to say that, you know what, we need to have a segregation of duties, we need some cross training, we need to make sure that people are okay with someone else stepping in and looking at things. If you have those control issues, to say, no, I'm going to be the one to pick up the bank statement from the bank or from the mailbox or from the bank, and I'm going to reconcile this, and nobody else needs to review that reconciliation. That is a behavioral red flag. Make sure that people are open to review and comment. Any irritability, suspiciousness, or defensiveness, you can kind of chuckle at this one and say, well, there's a lot of people that are irritable and defensive every day. That might be true, that their personality is such, but if you see changes in that, again, that's very, can be an indicator that there might be something going on, and that I need to pay attention to that. As well as the bullying or intimidation, just to say, you know what, that level of authoritarian which is not expected or not wanted, could be an area of concern, and again, one of those red flags to look at. And again, one or all of these in combination can be present. There are some times when none of them are there and a fraud is occurring. But again, these are just some of those things to keep in mind. That wheeler dealer attitude, maybe that tone at the top of being less than desirable, to say, you know what, we're going to cut corners, we're going to do things off the books, and again, that can be one of those behavioral red flags. As Michael mentioned, you know, the complaining about inadequate pay, that's a justification or, you know, realization for the fraud triangle to the rationalization component of it. The refusal to take those vacations. You know, that's a really good thing for a lot of organizations, and I know a family member of mine works for a very large bank, and they do have to take vacations, and they're actually locked out of the system so that they don't have access to things. That's, again, is that segregation of duties, that rotation of duties that would theoretically then uncover if there was a fraud taking place over a period of time. And then just those excessive pressures from within your organizations, unrealistic budgets and targets and those types of things that can lead to fraudulent reporting and or other fraudulent methods. So again, just all those things either individually or in combination are some of those behavioral red flags for you to watch for in your organization. From a personal perspective, living beyond your means, someone with a mid-level you know, position in your firm that makes a reasonable living, is driving a $150,000 car, has 4 homes. Maybe they got lucky and have a very large inheritance, but maybe not. Maybe they're living beyond their means and funding it through other methods that are not that are fraudulent. You know, just reports of financial difficulties, that water cooler talks. I would say, yeah, I know somebody's spouse just lost their job. A lot of times with you know, with the pandemic and things, there's been some financial difficulties. That increases the risk. So how are they compensating for that? And are they doing it through a fraudulent method within an organization? Any divorce or family problems? Again, you're going to probably hear about that in talking. It's like, yeah, things aren't going well. I'm going to be a single income person now, and that could be a challenge for me to pay the bills. So those addiction problems, as Michael had mentioned, the alcohol, gambling, drugs, those types of things. You may or may not know about that, but if you do have a reporting mechanism that can help you get those tips to say, you know what, I think something's going on with, I'm concerned about this person. They've really changed, and I think they're struggling, and I think they have an addiction problem or financial difficulties, things of that nature. Social isolation, again, that with the pandemic could be a lot of people these days. So just kind of keep an eye on that too, and make sure that you're comfortable that they're not isolating themselves. That could be a personal red flag as well. Legal problems, again, a good background check when you hire your key people should uncover any past legal problems, and as a result of that, we strongly recommend a good thorough background check on your key people. And then, you know, just for the last couple, instability in life circumstances, and then excessive family and peer pressure for success. And again, kind of living beyond those means to say I'm trying to keep up with someone down the block, or you know, a brother or sister or sibling, those types of things. And again, a lot of those you hear about through other employees in your organization. And that'll kind of lead us to how a lot of these fraud tips are discovered here on the next slide, if we want to move to that, Michael. Again, tip is 3 times the most effective way that these fraud schemes are being detected. So when we say a tip, that means someone within your organization or outside of your organization knows something's going on, and they want to report it. And they want to say, you know what, I want to do the ethical thing and tell them that there's something bad going on, and you need to investigate it. Internal audit and management review, number 2 and 3, about 16 and 12% respectively. Reviews of documentation at 6%. We always like to joke a little bit, but it's that by accident is 5%. And then by account reconciliation and external audit and data monitoring is less than that. So they're all about as effective, and sometimes you trip over it, sometimes you don't. But again, the fact that you do need a variety of things to have these detection of these fraud schemes, your external audit will help. Again, the external audits are not designed to discover fraud. They may find that, it might be if it's a material amount, but it's not designed, so don't rely specifically on your external audit. Make sure your internal audits, your management reviews, and your tip processes are in place so that you as an organization say, yeah, I feel comfortable that we've got good reporting mechanisms, and we've got good controls in place and good processes that we can identify the fraud if it's happening, and we'll cut down on the amount and the duration of that particular fraud as well. So, Michael, I don't know if you have any other comments on that detection of those fraud schemes before we move on.
No, I don't. The only thing that related to red flags that comes to mind is that in the cases in the ACFE study, 85% of the cases had at least one of those red flags displayed. And so if you have, it makes sense that that tip is the number one way that fraud is found, because employees are generally letting you know somehow that they're committing fraud, or that they have some sort of scheme going on. So being able to recognize those red flags can go a long way in helping an organization and helping employees know what to look for, and so that they could report it when they see it.
Excellent. So let's talk a little bit about how we can mitigate our fraud risks. Obviously, we've been talking about a variety of anti-fraud controls that you can implement. And why would you do that? Number one, you say, well, that's just cost me more money. I need to hire more people, or I need to take more time to do the internal management review and those types of things. And yes, that is true. But again, if you look at 5% of your revenues, I think it's a pretty quick decision that, you know what, a little bit of investment can lower my fraud risk pretty significantly. Those fraud controls will, just so you know, will lower your losses between 1/3 and 1/2. Hotlines actually, from a fraud loss perspective, go from 200,000 without fraud hotlines to 100,000 with fraud hotlines. So you cut your losses in half. That detection rate generally goes from about 18 months down to 12 months. So the presence of those controls is very, very effective. And again, something to consider as well. So whether it's management review, fraud hotlines, internal audit, any types of external review of your internal controls, additional controls that are implemented, all those types of things. Very much something that you should consider doing. A few things on the common anti-fraud controls then before we move on into our other areas of the presentation. The external audit of financial statements is a common anti-fraud control, but as I mentioned, only about 5% of frauds are caught with, or 4%, I guess, with external audit. So don't rely solely on that. Make sure you have a good code of conduct and that your tone at the top is good, and you say, we really want you to report any fraud that's happening within the organization if you know about it. If you're fortunate enough to be able to have resources to have an internal audit department, having it, by all means, implement that. Have a good internal audit plan, review that plan, look at the risks, make sure the risks are up to date, whether it's data analytics review on a monthly basis, or real-time data analytics review, whether it's monthly reviews of information, trend analysis, all those types of things. Internal audit would be very good. And if you don't have the internal audit, you can do that, with management as well, just probably in a more simplistic way. Certification of your financial statements. Again, that's a requirement for some of the public sector. Again, they're saying, you know what, if you're signing off on this, that's meaning you know it's right. And a lot of people won't sign off on it if they know something's wrong, and they're going to get in trouble. And again, another one is the external audit of those internal controls over financial reporting. So a deeper dive into the internal controls. The hotline, again, tips are over 40% of the fraud reporting mechanisms, if you want to say. So again, the detection. So again, consider a hotline, very cost effective. And it lets all your employees know that we care, we have a good code of conduct, we have a good tone at the top. We want you to report what you think is going on, because somebody does know something and they want to report it. They obviously want to stay anonymous so that there's no repercussions. And again, that's very important as well. Continue to do that internal management review, whether it's spot checking or every time. A little is better than none, and obviously the more you can do from a management perspective is the lower you'll lower your risks. Fraud training for employees. Part of that hotline thing as well is the fraud training, whether it's a hotline or not. Let them know what a fraud is, kind of what we're talking about today. What kind of training that you can implement and how you can report it, and things on that nature. And again, that can be very simple. We do an annual kind of a training here at the firm, and it's just a web-based, half hour, walks you through everything. So that's great. And then probably the newest and biggest thing that's coming on is the proactive data monitoring and analysis. Michael does a lot of data analytics within the firm. Some of it's real time to say, you know what, this transaction has a high risk. It's a new vendor, it's a round dollar amount, it's done on a weekend. It could be more reactive data monitoring to say, you know what, every month we're going to look at the data and say, where are the risky transactions? Why are we working with this particular vendor? Why are we paying this one, 15 checks this month when we did only 2 the prior month? And maybe there's a good reason, maybe there's not. So that whole data monitoring is very much on the forefront, and we can actually envision in the future that the audit will be being conducted almost every day or every week, and that at the end of the reporting cycle, every end of your year end, your financial statements have been basically audited throughout the year, and there's some type of a reporting mechanism there, rather than the auditors coming in 3 months after and looking at all the reactive data, if you want to say. So lots of great things available from an anti-fraud control perspective, and again, it's just all it's a balance. It's you want to implement things with the resources you have, and a lot of that can be internal management review, spot checking, and just making sure that you listen to your employees and have that pipeline open, if you want to say, to report those frauds. That will I'll pass it over to Michael, who actually wants to dive into a little bit more on that fraud detection on the hotline, since it is 3 times most effective in the fraud arena. I think it's worth our while today to walk through that and show you a little bit about how that might work in your organization. So, Michael.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So yeah, as Steve has been talking about over the last few minutes, there's all kinds of different common anti-fraud controls that can be implemented within organizations. Some of them are easier to implement than others. Some are more effective than others at finding fraud or preventing fraud, and some are more cost-effective than others. And so we're going to focus on fraud hotlines because of how effective they are in finding fraud and detecting fraud. How easy they are to implement, and then also at how cost effective they are. So we're first going to look at this slide that talks about the effectiveness of hotlines and reporting mechanisms. And really their fraud hotlines overall are just a really good risk mitigation tool. You're never going to be able to completely remove your fraud risk from your organization, but you will be able to mitigate that risk. And so by implementing new procedures such as a fraud hotline that is aimed at detecting fraud, your organization will increase your employees' perception that fraud is going to be detected. And it may help deter someone from committing fraud if that perception is there. And that perception is really the key. If employees are trained about fraud risks and they're given tools and information on what to do when fraud does happen, then it will oftentimes deter some people from committing fraud. If they know that the organization is doing something to find fraud and there's a good chance that they're going to be caught, they're less likely to move forward to commit fraud. So a fraud hotline is just a really good example of an anti-fraud control that instills that perception that fraud is going to be found. And it's also a really good tool because it allows, because all employees are made aware of the availability of a fraud hotline. In order for a fraud hotline to be effective, number one, employees need to be aware of it. They need to be reminded of it throughout the year so that they know it's there. And then number two, talking about tone at the top that Steve mentioned before, the top levels of management need to be on board with it, and they need to encourage the use. You want to make sure that that tone at the top says that we want this information, we want it, we want you to provide it. We welcome the information so that we can help our organization. And so again, it's that really good tool because all employees are made aware of it. Other anti-fraud controls that are implemented, such as internal control changes or data monitoring and analysis, for example, there's certainly good controls and good anti-fraud controls to have in place, but it will usually impact fewer employees, so it's not as well known that the organization is doing these things to try to find fraud. As Steve mentioned already too, fraud is detected faster in organizations with hotlines, and fraud is also that the amount lost to fraud is also 2 times higher at organizations without fraud hotlines. Steve mentioned employee training earlier as well. Employee training and letting employees know what fraud risks are, what some red flags are, increases the likelihood of detection by tip as well. Typically, when a fraud hotline is implemented, there is some high-level training that's made available to employees so that they know what to look for. And it's encouraged as well to do a little bit more in-depth training on fraud risks and things like that to again, just help further educate employees on what fraud is and what to look for. And then finally, having a fraud hotline can really just provide a peace of mind to owners, management, and even board members of an organization because you have all employees looking for fraud. So a hotline gives employees that mechanism to let management know what they're seeing. And a finance team or a management team can't possibly know everything that's happening within an organization. And so having the eyes and ears of all employees looking for it and kind of watching for can be extremely beneficial for an organization. So just a few examples that we have here of fraud that was uncovered by TIP, just to give you an idea of how tips can be useful. These examples here are really, all of them are related to government organizations, but they're really applicable to any organization. Information about schemes and things like that happen at governments are just more readily available to the public. And so those are the types of information that's available to be able to search. Whereas private organizations, most times they don't. The information isn't reported on, so it's not available for us to be able to see it. But anyway, the first case here is Coahoma Community College. And from the Clarion Ledger, they stated that an investigation was started after the state auditor received a tip from college officials. And so ultimately, 2 employees ended up using college credit cards and checks from about 2013 to 2017 to make more than $750,000 in personal purchases for different things like shoes, watches, gift cards, and other items. Yale University is the next one. The NPR had some information available on this where Yale officials received an anonymous tip that someone was ordering suspiciously high volumes of computer equipment. And those orders were made more suspicious by the fact that the employee was sometimes putting some of those packages in her own car. And so definitely a valid tip. And this particular case was the perpetrator was the director of finance and administration at the Yale School of Medicine. And starting in about 2013, she either ordered or she had some of her staff order computers and other electronics that ended up totaling thousands of items over almost 10 years. She then shipped those items to a business in New York in exchange for money once those electronics were resold. And so she ended up using the money just to live the high life, buy real estate, and travel quite a bit. So Yale ended up losing over $40 million from this scheme. And she recently just pleaded guilty last month in March of 2022. So that's quite a significant loss by an organization that stemmed from somebody submitting a tip on something that they knew about. The next case, Riverside County, California. So from the press enterprise, they indicated that an anonymous tip was received through the county's fraud hotline. And they found that $89,000 was spent on tuition, lodging, airfare, and then other related expenses related to that education. And these types of expenses didn't follow the county policies related to education reimbursement or even use of the county's credit card. And then they also were able to find as a result of this that $36,000 was spent on 2 leadership training programs that were available in-house from the county. So they didn't need to spend the money to go external because it was already available to them internally. The city of San Diego, from the San Diego Union Tribune, there were tips left on the city's fraud hotline. And based on that information that was submitted, they were able to substantiate accusations of medical leave fraud, abuse of leave time, an employee who wasn't performing their job duties at all, and then an employee that was taking recyclable materials for personal benefit. So in this particular case, none of these items resulted in a significant loss to the city, but with the help of the fraud hotline, they were able to find the problems early before they ended up causing significant losses to the city. And then the last case we have here is related to the state of Georgia. And so charges were just filed on this a couple months ago in February 2022. And there was an employee of the state that noticed that the lower portion of a coworker's stomach kind of came away from their body, came away from her coworker's body. And so they believe that the employee wore a fake pregnant stomach and so they ended up providing a tip to the state as a result of that. And so they found that the employee allegedly faked multiple pregnancies for paid time off. And upon investigation, they found no signs that this employee ever had a child, even though she reported the birth of children in July 2020, May 2021, and then she also tried to do it again by claiming she was pregnant in August of 2021. So again, not a significant loss to the state, but something that came to light because of a tip. So as we've learned today, the number one way that fraud is detected is by tip. And in many instances when fraud is not found by tip, we see that there was at least one person that knew something was going on, or at least suspected that something was going on. And when asked, why they didn't say anything, the answer is usually somewhere along the lines of, I didn't know who to tell, or I was afraid to tell someone because I didn't want to lose my job. And that's a really valid comment, because unfortunately, being a tipster, being a whistleblower, still ends up costing a lot of people personal financial hardships. They end up losing their job, they end up being demoted. So even though they're telling the truth, even though they're just telling what they know or what they've seen, and it's information that could help the organization, they end up having repercussions that affect them personally, even though it shouldn't. So having a mechanism in place to be able to allow an anonymous submission of information is really important, so that employees can trust that when they submit information, they don't have to worry about any repercussions to them personally. So for these reasons, we have created a tool that provides a mechanism for employees to safely and anonymously report information about known fraud or suspected fraud to an organization's management. And we name this tool Plainsight because fraud is often happening in clear view. We talked about red flags and things like that, where 85% of the cases there was some sort of red flag that could have tipped off somebody that something was happening or that there was likely fraud occurring. And so it just takes one person to see it and report it. And so for that reason, we named it Plainsight and think it's a pretty good name for it. It's really just a great risk mitigation tool that allows employees, again, to anonymously report information that they know about fraud or suspicions of fraud to management of their organization. And so we talked a few minutes ago about several different anti-fraud controls that could be implemented to mitigate fraud risks. And Plainsight is, again, one of those that is more cost-effective. It's one of those more cost-effective anti-fraud controls that can be implemented. And when we developed Plainsight, we really focused on the anonymity side of it, because we wanted to make sure that employees are comfortable with submitting information. We wanted to make sure that they can trust that the information that they're providing will be anonymous and it won't come back to them. So we made sure that we did everything we could to ensure the anonymity of those submitting information, and then also just that the system itself is safe and secure. And Plainsight does have a web application and a phone application, both of which are easy to use. And ultimately, it's a tool that empowers employees to speak up when they know something and provide information that can help their organization, can help protect their organization against people that want to harm it. And so fraud happens all the time in any organization, whether it's a large organization or a small organization, whether it's a nonprofit, a government organization, private or a public business. And so a tool like this is really effective for any organization, and it can be beneficial for any type of organization. So for the rest of the time here today, we just wanted to go through a quick demo of Plainsight using some screenshots from the web application. So to start out, we go if you go to plainsitefraudhotline.com, you'll come to this screen here where you see a place where you can submit a new tip, or you can review an existing tip. And so we'll go through how to submit a new tip shortly here, but we also have that option here to review an existing tip, because we want to make sure that when somebody submits a tip, that they come back and have that ability to come back and check the status of their tip, add more information if they come across more information after they submit their initial tip, and then also have a way to anonymously communicate back and forth with management of the organization. And so we'll talk about that in a little bit. But first, if we go, if we would click on Submit a New Tip, we'd come to this screen where we ask for an organization code. And when an organization subscribes to Plainsight, they'll be provided with an organization code that's specific to their organization. And Plainsight just uses that so you know which organization the tip is related to. So once you enter the organization code, the organization name will pop up and you can hit continue. And then you come to the screen where it asks you to enter the information that you're aware of. So there are a few different things here. Your relationship to the company, just trying to get an idea of how you're related to the organization, if you're a current employee, former employee, a vendor, customer, that type of thing. And then the next request is something that I really like about the system. So when an organization subscribes to Plainsight, we recommend that they choose 3 different people from the management team that will be administrators for their organization, administrators of Plainsight. And so those 3 people will receive all tips when they come in. So if a tip is submitted related to their organization, they'll get an email indicating that there's a tip in there. And the part that I really like is that when somebody comes in to submit a tip, we recognize that somebody that's set to receive the tip may be involved in the issue, they may be involved in the fraud. And so when a user comes in to submit a tip, they can see a list of those people that are going to be getting the tip internally. And if they know, like in this instance, Becky, the controller, is involved or may be involved in it, they can select that person to not receive the tip. And this is really important because we want to make sure that the people involved aren't notified that somebody knows something and somebody has let the organization know about what they're doing. And so the next questions are just trying to get information about what you know and what the issue is. This particular example I just entered some information about credit card activity and it being used for personal use by the controller. There's a few more questions, and then on the bottom, you also have an opportunity to submit or to upload documents or supporting documents to support the information that you're providing. So in this particular example, if it's a credit card, personal purchases on a credit card, you might be able to upload some credit card statements that show what those personal purchases were. So once you're done submitting everything that you wanted to submit, you'll hit continue, and that'll bring you to a page to create a passphrase. And this is really just kind of a 2-factor authenticator so that the user has a second way to identify themselves when they come back in to review their existing tip. So you'll need that passphrase along with this tip code that will be automatically assigned to the user, to the tipster after they submit the tip. And we do not know anything about, we do not know what the tip codes are, what the passphrases are. So the individual that submits the tip is the only person that knows what it is, and we're not able to go back into the system to look it up for anybody. So the user, the person that submits the tip, is the only one that has this information available to them. So ultimately, so that's how to submit a tip. It's really easy to do, really easy to use. And then just real quickly, on that first page that we went to, there was that option to review an existing tip. So if you click that button, it'll bring you here. where it asks you to enter that tip code that you received after you submitted the tip, and then that passphrase that you created, just again as kind of a second level of security for the individual that submitted the tip. And so when you come back in to see it, you will see the information exactly as you entered it. So you'll see all the questions that were asked and the information that you provided. And then you'll also be able to see the date and time that you submitted it, and then the current status of that tip. So the management, those 3 people from the management team are able to change the status, whether they're looking into the tip, whether it's in the process of being investigated, or whether it was deemed invalid for whatever reason. And so you'll be able to see that. And then another part that I really like is that there's this comment section or this chat function where you can anonymously chat back and forth with that user. So between the management team and the user. And so this is where if management has additional or has follow-up questions for the person that submitted the tip, they can ask those questions here. If the person that submitted the tip comes across more information that might be helpful, they can come back and to this comment section and add more information here. And because we don't know who the tipster is, we don't know who that person is, it's all up to that person to come back in and look for follow-up questions from the management team and to check the status. So we highly encourage users to come back and look for any status updates or anything like that. So that really is just a quick overview of PlainSight and how it works. And again, we think it's a really good tool. We think it's something that is beneficial for all organizations. So we have a webinar special going on right now where you get 20% off the first year subscription fee. This is good through tomorrow, through the end of the day tomorrow. So if you email us at plainsight@bergenkdv.com, you can request a quote. Or if you have any questions or anything like that, any further questions about PlainSight or want some more information, just email that, or certainly email Steve or myself as well, and then mention the webinar special. So with that, I'll open it up we've got a few minutes left for any questions that have come up.
Yeah, Michael, I've been moderating and watching for questions, and there is a 2-part question here that they'd like. And it's this is, I have an organization that's 10 or 15 employees. Is PlainSight still effective for that small of an organization, or is it really for more of a larger organization? And then the second part to that is, if I have like 50 employees or 500 employees, approximately what is the cost of PlainSight? Is it something that's thousands of dollars or hundreds of dollars? And maybe just a little bit of clarity on that would be helpful for the viewers today.
Yeah, so I think as far as the small organizations, it is certainly beneficial whether you have 10 or 15 employees or 5,000 employees. And in some ways, it might even be more beneficial in a smaller organization, because you likely have more risks because of not having as many employees available to segregate duties, to have better internal control structures. So having a tool to be able to report what somebody knows would be really beneficial. And then, the cost of it for a small organization with 50 employees, we're talking about $500 a year to have that available to all employees. And it goes up from there based on the number of employees you have. 500 employees, I think, would cost about $750 per year. So okay. Again, really cost effective, really reasonable to have available for all employees. Excellent.
And I know, Michael, you had mentioned about the availability, letting the employees know within an organization is key for the effectiveness of the tip reporting. How do employees generally know about the availability of PlainSight if someone were to sign up? Maybe just a little bit about the kind of the onboarding process might be helpful too with the last minute that we have here in our time.
Yeah, I'll try to make it quick. So yeah, it certainly is important to make sure that employees know about it. So we have some tools We have some posters and some electronic documents to help organizations communicate to their employees the availability of PlanSight. And we also have some verbiage that can be used kind of as a template to include when you send out an email to employees letting them know about the availability and implementation of PlanSight.
Okay, excellent. So yeah, again, please reach out to us if you're interested and have further questions. We're happy to answer those. And again, just a couple reminders before we wrap up here. We will be sending out a recording and presentation link, which you can look back for that. And then there'll be a short survey coming your way as well. So please feel free to leave some feedback and a space to add any additional questions you may have, and we're happy to respond to those as well. So with that, I will say thank you for your attendance today. We're just about 1 minute over, and hopefully we'll get you back on your way so you can continue the rest of your day. Hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day and rest of your week. Thanks for joining us today. Michael, any final comments?
Nope, just thank you again, as Steve mentioned, and please reach out if you have any questions about fraud risks or if you would like any more information about PlanSight.
Excellent, wonderful. Well, again, thank you all so very much. We appreciate your attendance today, and have a great afternoon.